Welcome to True Echo, where real courage meets the road, and the stories we tell echo far beyond the screen. Today's story begins with a routine traffic stop. But what happens next will redefine what respect, loyalty, and honor look like, when one quiet man stands tall and an army shows up to say, "You will not disrespect our own." This is the story of Walter Jennings, and it's one you won't forget. The road curved like a ribbon of freedom beneath Walter Jennings's Harley. It was Sunday, and that meant one thing: no obligations. The open stretch of Highway 17 outside Summerville, South Carolina, offered Walter the one thing he still truly loved: silence. Not the kind found in empty rooms, but the kind that existed between man and machine, between wind and memory. His Harley's low growl was like a familiar song humming beneath him. Walter was 52. Not old, but older than he felt most days. 21 years in the Army, Desert Storm, 5 deployments, 3 tours stateside, had left more than their share of dents. 2 bad knees, a shoulder that clicked when it rained, and a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. He didn't like to talk about what he'd done. Not because he was ashamed, but because too many talked too much and remembered too little. His leather vest was worn, sun-bleached along the edges, stitched with his old unit patch. It was one of the few things he always wore when riding. And his hat, Desert Storm veteran embroidered in gold thread, never left his head on a Sunday. People usually noticed. Usually nodded. Honked. Kids sometimes waved, and the old-timers saluted. But not today. Walter rounded a soft curve near a rundown gas station and noticed the 2 patrol cars immediately. They were angled just enough to make their presence known. He didn't speed up or slow down, just kept cruising at a clean 48 miles per hour, steady and smooth. When the blue lights flipped on behind him, he sighed. Not with fear, just fatigue. He pulled to the shoulder, killed the engine, and placed his hands on the bars, methodical, practiced. He had taught younger soldiers how to de-escalate situations like this. Stay calm. Stay still. Be clear. Do not give them a reason. A tall, young officer stepped out. Probably no older than 30, with a rigid walk and mirrored sunglasses that screamed, "I've been waiting to make a bust." His partner stayed in the cruiser. The young one approached like Walter had already done something wrong. "License and registration," the officer barked, hand brushing his belt. Walter handed over his license, registration, and, just for good measure, his military ID. The officer looked them over, eyes squinting behind those useless mirrors. "Where you coming from?" "Home." "Where's that?" "Latson." "Took the scenic route." "Where you headed?" "National Guard Post. Lincoln Highway. I'm scheduled to speak there at 3. The officer glanced at his partner. Then leaned in closer. "You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for." Walter tilted his head. "What suspect?" "Black male. Black motorcycle. Wearing a vest." Walter looked at his vest. Looked at his bike. Then at the officer. A laugh escaped his lips, dry and sharp. "Well, you got me," he said. "You've narrowed it down to half the state." The officer didn't like that. "I'm going to need you to step off the bike, sir." Walter didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just asked one question: "Is this how you treat everyone with a veteran ID, or just the ones who look like me?" The silence that followed was icy. The younger officer didn't answer. Instead, he waved his partner over. Walter could tell by the body language, stiff, twitchy, nervous under pressure, that they hadn't expected a man like him to push back. He wasn't loud. Wasn't aggressive. But he was calm in a way that unsettled men used to asserting authority through volume. The second officer, stockier and older, stepped out of the vehicle with a wary look. His eyes moved between Walter and the military ID still held by his partner. He took in the details: the patched leather vest, the Desert Storm cap, the dog tags glinting faintly beneath the collar. And yet, despite all of it, he asked. Everything check out? Plates clean. License matches, the younger one muttered. Then why is he still on the side of the road? Because, the younger officer hesitated. He's being difficult. Walter raised an eyebrow. By answering your questions? By giving you everything you asked for. The first officer turned and began circling Walter's bike. Peering at the tags. Tugging on the saddlebags. Even crouching down to inspect the tires. Like he was hoping something illegal would fall out by accident. But there was nothing to find. Walter hadn't ridden this bike over thousands of miles just to get sloppy. As the officer called something into the radio, Walter picked up on the codes, possible match, requesting backup. It wasn't about protocol anymore. It was about pride. You live around here, the second officer asked, trying to recalibrate the situation. 20 minutes east. Bought the house in '02. Paid off in full. You work? I served, Walter said. Now I speak. Mentor. Help new recruits transition into civilian life. Same as today, scheduled to speak at 3 o'clock. The older cop paused, clearly processing. This man didn't match the suspect profile. And more importantly, he didn't act like someone hiding anything. But they were already too deep. To let him go now was to admit they'd made a mistake. And in law enforcement, ego often weighs heavier than truth. I'm going to call and verify your story, the younger officer said, turning Walter's military ID over in his fingers like it was counterfeit. Walter exhaled slowly. You've got my name, my credentials, my ID. You really think someone impersonating a veteran of 21 years would be wearing a cap like this on a Sunday afternoon? Standard procedure, the officer replied. So was I, Walter said quietly. For 21 years. And we didn't treat people like this. The air tensed. Not with fear. But with something more dangerous, scrutiny. Then, Walter's phone buzzed in his vest pocket. He didn't check it, didn't move, but he already knew who it was. Captain Elijah Brooks. He'd missed check-in. Walter never missed check-ins. The first officer was still on the radio, requesting verification of Walter's background, wasting time, doubling down, drawing a crowd. Cars had begun to slow on the opposite side of the road. A man at the gas station stood outside filming with his phone. A mother at the pump glanced nervously between Walter and the officers. But it was already too late. Because what the officers didn't know, and what Walter understood with a clarity that came from decades in uniform, was that someone was already on the way. Captain Elijah Brooks stood at the edge of the National Guard training facility, arms crossed, jaw tight, scanning the parking lot like a hawk. The event was scheduled for 3. It was 2:47. And Walter Jennings was never late. Not once in the years Elijah had known him. Sergeant First Class Reggie Dunlap jogged up, clipboard in hand. Still no sign. No, Elijah muttered. Think maybe he got a flat. Not Walter. If he had a flat, he'd push that Harley 30 miles just to keep his word. Then Elijah remembered something, the badge system. Every speaker, including retired personnel, had a GPS tracker attached to their visitor ID. Passive tracking. Mostly ignored. Reggie, Elijah said, voice firm. Pull Jennings's GPS tag. You think it's that serious? Do it. 2 minutes later, they had the answer. The signal showed Walter stationary, parked on the shoulder of Highway 17, just 6 miles from the county line. That's not the route he usually takes, Elijah said, brows furrowed. You think it's an accident? No, Elijah said, his voice low. He's on his feet. Which means he's either waiting, or being made to wait. Reggie stared. You think he got stopped? I don't think. I know. Elijah turned, already shouting orders. Prep 2 Humvees. Full squad. Uniformed. Quiet and clean. Now. Sir. Move. In less than 10 minutes, a convoy of 30 soldiers had mobilized. And Elijah wasn't done. He made 3 calls on the ride out, 2 to nearby logistics squads, 1 to HQ. By the time they rolled toward the edge of Highway 17, the convoy had grown. 50 soldiers strong. Not a protest. Not a mob. Just one message, moving with thunder. You do not humiliate one of our own. By the time the lead Humvee crested the rise near the gas station, the situation had already drawn eyes. Walter stood calmly beside his Harley, arms crossed now, boots planted, and his face unreadable. Not because he was indifferent, because he had been here before. Not this exact shoulder, not these same officers, but in this same position, accused without reason, detained without cause, profiled without guilt. And yet, he didn't flinch. Not when the younger officer began pacing again, not when the second kept checking over his shoulder, and not when passing cars slowed to stare. The longer the stop dragged on, the more people noticed. A father with his son in a pickup truck paused near the gas station. The clerk from the minimart stepped outside with a half-wrapped sandwich still in her hand. The man with the phone was still filming, though now, the camera pointed toward the horizon. Because they all heard it. A low, deep rumble that didn't match the casual flow of civilian traffic. One Humvee. Then another. Then another. At first, the officers didn't react. Highway patrol was used to military traffic in South Carolina. But not like this. Not 11 vehicles in formation. Not full combat dress. Not a flag on the front bumper of the lead truck, the kind only flown when command-level officers were on board. The younger cop stiffened. The second officer took an involuntary step backward. Walter didn't move. But a slow smile crept to his lips, not smug, not gloating. Just the quiet smile of a man who knew that when you lived right, when you served right, people showed up for you. The lead Humvee pulled up and parked directly behind the patrol cars. The door opened slowly. Captain Elijah Brooks stepped out, every inch of him composed and commanding. Boots laced tight, crisp fatigue uniform, face unreadable, but eyes sharp as glass. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't bark. Just walked, calm and purposeful, straight toward Walter. You all right, sir? Elijah asked. Walter nodded. Was waiting on you. The crowd, now larger, now hushed, watched, spellbound. No one reached for their phones anymore. They didn't need to. They knew this moment would live in memory. Elijah turned to the 2 officers, who stood frozen in place. You the ones who stopped this man? The younger officer cleared his throat. Yes, sir. We had a description. A suspect. Black male on a black motorcycle with a vest. He matched. You ran his ID? Elijah asked flatly. Yes. You got his name? Yes. And after all that, you kept him here. Why? The officer stammered. Protocol. Just, trying to do our job. Elijah stepped forward, eyes locked on the man. Your job. Your job is to serve. Your job is to protect. But your job is not to parade a decorated veteran on the side of the highway like a criminal. The second officer spoke up, softer, clearly shaken. We didn't know who he was. And that, Elijah said, stepping even closer, is the problem. You didn't see a man. You saw a profile. A checklist. You saw color before you saw honor. Walter remained still but turned slightly toward the crowd. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, but it carried. You could have asked me anything, he said. And I would have answered. With respect. The same way I served, for you, for this country, for this community. He looked the younger officer square in the eyes. But instead, you treated me like I was a threat. Like I didn't belong on this road. And that's what hurts. Because I fought for the right to ride it freely. A woman across the street clapped once. Then again. Then a few more people joined her. The sound was small but growing. Walter turned back to the officers. I've been through more than you could imagine. Led men into combat. Pulled brothers out of burning wreckage. And I came home just wanting one thing, peace. The second officer lowered his eyes. The first seemed unsure if he should defend himself again or apologize. But Walter wasn't looking for apologies. He was looking for change. Elijah stepped beside him, still quiet, still composed. You ready to go, sir? Walter smiled gently. Been ready. But before he moved toward the Humvee, Walter pulled something from inside his vest, a folded, slightly crumpled piece of paper. My speech, he said, handing it to the second officer. You might want to read it. Might teach you something they didn't cover in training. The officer looked down, hands trembling slightly. Walter nodded, then turned and walked toward the Humvee. Elijah opened the door for him, a small gesture. But it carried the weight of respect earned through decades of sacrifice. As Walter stepped inside, the soldiers didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was the statement. And the crowd? They didn't cheer. They didn't chant. They just stood in reverent silence. Watching a man reclaim his dignity, not with vengeance, but with quiet, unshakable pride. The convoy began to move, slow and deliberate, like a living wall of honor stretching down Highway 17. 50 soldiers in full uniform, heads high, eyes forward, not in anger, not in protest, but in quiet, coordinated solidarity. The kind of display that made strangers stop in awe. The sound of the engines reverberated through the small town, vibrating the windows of the gas station and making loose signs flap in the breeze. People came out of the diner down the road, napkins still in hand. Drivers pulled over to the side and got out of their cars to watch it unfold. Because whatever this was, they understood instinctively, it mattered. Walter sat in the front passenger seat of the lead Humvee, arms resting lightly on his knees. Elijah sat beside him, hands on the wheel but eyes occasionally darting toward his old mentor. Didn't expect you to roll that deep, Walter said finally, his voice amused. Elijah grinned, eyes still forward. Didn't expect you not to call. I figured it'd speak louder if I didn't. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full of history, shared operations, late nights over busted gear, funerals attended together, medals quietly accepted and stored away like burdens. What you said back there, Elijah said, the way you stood still and spoke, people are going to remember that. Walter nodded slowly. I hope they remember it for the right reasons. Not just because I'm a vet. But because I'm a man. They pulled into the Florence National Guard facility nearly an hour after Walter had been scheduled to speak. Word had already spread throughout the base. Soldiers lined the entry as the Humvees passed through, each one saluting as Walter went by. When Walter stepped out, the auditorium was already filled. Soldiers, officers, support staff. Some had seen the footage already. Others had just heard. But every single person stood as he entered, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And Walter didn't say a word for nearly a full minute. He stood at the center of the stage, looking at the same young recruits he had once been. The same ones now looking at him like a legend. He unfolded the crumpled speech in his hands. Looked at it. Then folded it again and placed it in his vest pocket. I had something prepared, he said, voice low but clear. But I think we've all had enough of plans today. A few soldiers chuckled quietly. So let me tell you something I wasn't planning to say. Something they don't always print in the handbooks. He stepped forward, and the room leaned in. Service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Neither does dignity. And sometimes, what breaks a man isn't what he saw in the field, it's how he's treated afterward. You could hear a pin drop. I didn't come here today to talk about war. I came to talk about peace. The kind we're all still fighting for. Because the fight isn't always with enemies overseas. Sometimes it's with silence. With assumptions. With the way we're seen when nobody's clapping anymore. A few heads lowered, quietly taking it in. I stood on that road today, not because I was a criminal, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because someone looked at me and decided I might be dangerous. And what gave me peace wasn't proving him wrong, it was knowing that I wasn't standing alone. Walter scanned the room. His eyes paused on each young face. Every one of you in here is more than your rank. More than your MOS. You are history in motion. And how you treat the people who came before you, how you carry that badge, that uniform, that's your legacy. He paused. Then delivered the words that would echo long after the day was over. It's not always war that leaves scars. Sometimes, it's how you're seen when the fighting's done. There wasn't a sound. Not even a cough. And then, softly, slowly, someone in the back began clapping. Then another. And another. Until the entire room rose again, not out of ceremony, but out of something far more powerful. Gratitude. Respect. Recognition. The applause faded gradually, not because the moment ended, but because everyone in that room understood they had just witnessed something real, something raw. Not just a speech, but a reckoning. Walter stepped down from the stage with quiet humility. He didn't bask in the standing ovation. He simply nodded to a few familiar faces, clasped hands with old friends, and exited the hall the same way he came in, calm, unshaken, steady. Outside, the sunlight had dipped behind a veil of soft clouds. The line of Humvees remained parked along the side of the facility, soldiers gathered in loose formation. They weren't ready to disperse. Not yet. Many stood in small clusters, talking about what had just happened, some still watching the video now circulating online. It had already hit social media like a lightning strike. Footage from the barber shop. From the gas station parking lot. From the mother in the pickup truck whose 12-year-old had recorded the convoy's arrival from the back seat. The captions varied, but the theme was clear. They stopped the wrong man. This is what real brotherhood looks like. Respect doesn't wear a uniform, it carries it. Walter sat quietly on a bench near the flagpole outside the hall, sipping water and watching the clouds roll by. He hadn't expected this, not the convoy, not the reaction, not the public swell of support. But what meant most to him wasn't the internet's validation. It was that a town had seen something they could no longer unsee. He heard footsteps behind him. Familiar ones. Captain Elijah Brooks sat down beside him with a deep breath. "Well," Elijah said, rubbing the back of his neck, "you made it a memorable afternoon." Walter smirked. "Didn't plan to. Just wanted to ride." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the faint sounds of soldiers talking behind them. "You think it'll change anything?" Elijah asked, not as an officer, but as a man. Walter shrugged. "Not all at once. But maybe, just maybe, someone starts seeing before assuming. Maybe a kid who saw it today grows up asking better questions. That'd be enough." Elijah nodded. "You know what I keep thinking about? The officers. Especially the younger one. His face when the Humvees rolled up. Looked like he saw the truth for the first time," Walter said. "And didn't know what to do with it." They both laughed, just a little, but it wasn't bitter. It was something closer to hope. Later that night, Walter drove home alone. No convoy. No crowd. Just him and the road again, the wind whispering around him like an old friend. But this time, his ride didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a return. To himself. To what he stood for. The moment that could have humiliated him had instead amplified something deeper, his presence, his integrity, his unwavering sense of self. When he pulled into his driveway, the porch light was already on. He stepped off the Harley, his knees popping just a little more than usual. He didn't rush inside. Instead, he stood still, hands on his hips, eyes on the stars. And that's when he saw the text message. From a number he didn't recognize. It read. Mr. Jennings. I saw what happened today. I was one of the officers who watched from a distance. You don't know me. But you changed the way I think. I'm sorry for what happened. And I'm grateful you didn't let it break you. Officer Harris. Walter didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply nodded, slowly, and walked inside. Because maybe that's how it begins, not with anger, not with shame, but with one person deciding to see differently. The next morning came quietly. Walter was up before dawn, as always. Old habits didn't die, they marched on. By 5:30, he'd already brewed his coffee, fed the neighborhood cat that always stopped by, and sat on his porch with the same folded paper from yesterday, his speech, still a bit creased, still smudged at the corners. He wasn't reading it. He was remembering it. Not just the words, but the moment, the weight of standing still under judgment, and the louder power of dignity that never once raised its voice. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Elijah. Capt. Brooks, turn on the local news. Channel 4. You might want to see this. Walter flipped on the living room TV and stood there in his house slippers, arms crossed as the headline rolled across the bottom of the screen. Veteran detained without cause, military convoy responds in show of unity. The anchors didn't sensationalize it. They didn't need to. The story had already gone viral. Interviews from bystanders. Footage from across the street. A freeze frame of Walter standing beside his Harley, arms calmly folded as the Humvees approached from behind like a wall of guardians. It was a perfect shot. Quiet. Poised. Powerful. A woman anchor, clearly moved, ended the segment with a soft comment, sometimes, you don't need sirens or shouting to make a stand. Sometimes, presence is enough. Walter turned the TV off. He wasn't interested in fame. He hadn't done it to be seen. But part of him hoped that people who did watch would feel something stir. Not pity. Not outrage. But recognition. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about every person who'd ever been mistaken for less because of how they looked or what someone assumed. By noon, the Florence Police Department issued a formal apology. Their spokesperson called the stop a regrettable instance of misidentification, citing a vague suspect report and internal training deficiencies. It was the kind of apology Walter had heard before. Vague. Institutional. Safe. He didn't respond publicly. But he did receive another text later that day. Unknown number, I was the officer who took your ID. I read your speech. All of it. A few seconds passed. Gavin Trent, I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I did. I thought protocol was enough. It's not. What you said, it stuck. I see you now. And I'm trying to see myself too. Walter stared at the message. It was a start. That night, at the community center just 2 blocks from his house, Walter gave a talk to a small group of local teens and parents. It was informal, no uniform, no medals, no titles. Just Walter, a chair, and his words. He talked about judgment. He talked about the weight of assumptions. He talked about how power doesn't always come with a gun or a badge, but with the decision to stay human, even when it's hard. And when the talk ended, someone stayed behind. A young man in civilian clothes. Clean-shaven. Broad-shouldered. Nervous energy in every step. Mr. Jennings, he said quietly. Walter looked up. Officer Trent. Gavin nodded. I wasn't planning to speak, the young man said. I just wanted to listen. And to say, thank you. Not just for your service. For your patience. Walter studied him for a long second. You meant what you said in that text. I did. You sure you're ready to change the way you see people? I'm trying. Walter stood and extended a hand. Gavin took it. Then that's enough, for now, Walter said. But keep showing up. That's how the world changes. And that handshake, that quiet, mutual moment, was more than a gesture. It was a seed. The kind that grows slow. But grows strong. Weeks passed. The incident on Highway 17 faded from the trending feeds, but not from memory. It was still whispered in quiet corners of the community, at barbershops, breakfast counters, church parking lots. Not as gossip, but as something reverent. Something etched. Walter Jennings never sought the spotlight. After the convoy, he went back to his routines, mentoring at the local guard post, hosting Sunday ride-alongs with young vets, showing up at the community center every Thursday like clockwork. But his presence meant more now. To some, he had become a symbol. To others, a lesson. But to most, especially those who knew what it was to be dismissed before a word was spoken, he had become proof that dignity could stand firm without raising its voice. One evening, a quiet ceremony was held at the Florence National Guard base. No press. No big cameras. Just a few rows of folding chairs, a podium, and the men and women who had shown up in those Humvees. Captain Elijah Brooks called it an informal appreciation, but everyone present knew better. When Walter was called forward, a silence fell across the field. Elijah spoke first. We talk a lot about service. About what it means to wear the uniform. But what happened that day reminded us all, service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It continues in how you walk, how you speak, and how you stand. He reached into a small case and pulled out a plaque. It read, To Walter Jennings, for showing us that the strongest response isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just standing tall. Walter stepped forward slowly, accepted the plaque with both hands, then faced the gathered soldiers. I didn't do anything special, he said softly. I just didn't move. That line made its way around the base for weeks, I just didn't move. It was repeated in training drills, on recruiting posters, even scribbled in chalk on the sidewalk near the community center. Not as a slogan, but as a reminder. Back in town, things had shifted. People began recognizing Walter more often, not just with nods, but with longer conversations. A teenage boy at the corner store who'd once been wary around uniformed men now walked up and asked about enlistment. A young black mother thanked Walter for what he'd said at the community center. Even a few officers, quietly and carefully, began attending his sessions on bias and community healing. And Officer Gavin Trent? He kept showing up. Every Thursday. Every talk. He never spoke in front of the group. But he listened, took notes, and helped clean up afterward. One night, as they were folding chairs together, he looked over at Walter. You know, he said, I used to think strength was about control. Authority. But it's not. It's about restraint. Walter nodded. And responsibility. Gavin paused. I want to be that kind of cop. Walter smiled faintly. Then keep showing up. Not just here. Out there. That night, Gavin stayed longer than usual. When he finally left, Walter sat alone for a while, staring at the stack of chairs, at the plaque tucked under his jacket, at the door he always left unlocked for anyone who needed to walk through it. His phone buzzed once. A message from Elijah. Thought you'd want to know, your story's being used in officer training at HQ now. Mandatory viewing. Walter didn't reply. He didn't need to. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about a traffic stop. Or a convoy. Or a mistaken identity. It was about what happens when you strip away the noise and stand, fully seen, for who you are. A man. A veteran. A leader. A presence. And long after the headlines vanished, after the videos lost their clicks, people still remembered the moment those Humvees rolled in. Not because of what they came to do. But because of who they came for. In a world quick to judge and even quicker to forget, Walter Jennings stood still, and reminded us all of something powerful, that dignity doesn't come from uniform or title, but from how you live when no one's clapping. It's not always war that leaves scars. Sometimes, it's the way you're seen when the fighting's over. If this story moved you, share it. Not just online, but in conversation, in your community, in the way you choose to see others. And if you believe in stories that uplift, challenge, and echo long after they're told, subscribe to True Echo, leave a comment, and pass it on.